The first time Samuel Hayes saw her, she was standing at the edge of the dusty trail that wound up to his weathered homestead. Arms wrapped tight around a worn carpet bag, head tilted against the desert wind, and nothing but the clothes on her back and a letter clutched in her thin fingers. The sun beat down merciless on the cracked earth, and she swayed slightly like the heat might carry her off, but her boots stayed planted firm. He didn't know her name yet, didn't know where she'd walked from or why her face looked hollowed out like she'd forgotten what food tasted like. All he knew was that his father had written to the mission in Santa Fe asking for help. And this woman, barely past 20 by the look of her, was what arrived. His ranch wasn't much to speak of anymore. The drought had lasted 3 years running, turning the grass to powder and the creek to nothing but stones. The cattle had dwindled to a handful of stubborn longhorns that grazed on dust and hope. Inside the adobe house, his father, Thomas Hayes, once a man who could break horses and drive cattle from Texas to Kansas, now lay propped against pillows, his breathing rattled and weak. A fever had settled in his chest that wouldn't break, and Samuel hadn't left the ranch in weeks except to ride to town for medicine that didn't work. He didn't have patience for strangers or time for charity cases, but as he watched the woman look up at the sagging porch, her lips cracked from the sun and her dark eyes shadowed with exhaustion, something shifted in his chest like a dam breaking loose. She introduced herself quiet and direct. "My name's Rose," she said, voice nearly lost in the wind. "Rose Delacroix. I came from the mission in Santa Fe. Father Miguel said you needed help." She didn't meet his eyes when she spoke, and he didn't press, just nodded and stepped aside to let her in. Rose moved through the house like someone accustomed to silence and sorrow. She didn't ask questions about the dust that had settled thick on everything, or the sour smell of sickness that hung in the stale air. Thomas eyed her with suspicion at first, that sharp voice still holding on to pride despite the fever burning him hollow. "She's just a girl," he wheezed to Samuel when Rose had stepped outside to draw water from the well. "What's she going to do here but wither up like everything else?" But Rose didn't wither. She stayed. She pressed cool cloths to Thomas's burning forehead and coaxed him to drink broth when he claimed he couldn't stomach food. She swept the floors without being asked, mended the torn curtains, and patched holes in the roof with strips of canvas. Samuel watched her from a distance, unsettled by how steady she was, how quiet. He wasn't used to it, not since everything had started falling apart. At night, Samuel sat on the front steps, staring out at the endless expanse of desert while the cattle moved slow and restless in the darkness. He thought of his mother, who died bringing his baby sister into the world when he was 15. Thought of that sister, who'd lived only 3 days before following their mother into the ground. He'd learned not to count on people staying, because in his world, they left or died or broke you open before disappearing into dust. But Rose was still there every morning, her movements a little less guarded, her voice a little less whispered. Still, there was something in her that wouldn't settle. Sometimes he'd catch her standing by the old mesquite tree, staring toward the mountains like she was waiting for something to come riding over the ridge. When he asked, she'd offer a thin smile and shake her head. "Just thinking," she'd say, but he knew the look of someone carrying ghosts. Thomas warmed to her slowly. One morning, Samuel walked into the main room to find the two of them bent over a piece of leather, Thomas's shaking hands guiding Rose's through the stitching of a bridle. It was the first time he'd heard his father laugh in months, a rough, cracked sound, but genuine. Rose had that effect on the house. Like slowly, day by day, she was coaxing life back into the dried-up bones of it. And still, Samuel kept his distance, not out of coldness, but out of fear. She was too young, too quiet, too haunted by whatever had driven her to walk alone across the desert to a stranger's door. He didn't know what shadows followed her, and he didn't know how to ask. What would he say? Who hurt you before you came here? He had no right. But the signs were there, written in the careful way she moved, the way she never sat with her back to a door, the way she flinched when men's voices got too loud in town. One night, He passed her room and heard her crying. Not loud or wild, just soft, careful tears, like she was trying not to take up space, even in her grief. He stood outside her door for a long time, fist raised to knock, before walking away. She never spoke of family, never wrote letters, never asked to go to town unless it was necessary. Sometimes when Thomas had fallen asleep and the chores were done, Rose would sit on the fence rail with her arms around her knees, staring toward the horizon like it might tell her what to do next. Samuel began noticing small things, how she never turned her back on strangers, how her hands trembled sometimes for no reason he could see, how she kept a small knife tucked in her boot, the handle worn smooth from use. And slowly, the curiosity in his chest turned into something deeper. Not pity, he sensed she'd hate that, but a kind of quiet, fierce respect. Because whatever had torn her apart hadn't taken her gentleness. One afternoon, while mending fence near the south pasture, he found her kneeling beside a dead jackrabbit, its neck broken clean. Her hands were shaking when she looked up at him. "Coyote got it," she whispered, though her voice sounded far away. Used to happen back home, too. But the way she stared down at it, like she was seeing something else entirely, made Samuel uneasy. Still, she stayed. Day after day, she cooked and cleaned and tended to Thomas, never once asking for anything in return. Not wages, not comfort, not even kindness. And maybe that's what broke Samuel more than anything, that she never expected to be treated like she mattered. The weeks bled into months. Thomas's fever broke finally, but left him weak as water. The heat pressed down like a weight, and Rose started leaving her window open at night, even when the desert air offered no relief. Samuel didn't ask why. He just started checking the perimeter before bed, rifle in hand, telling himself it was for rattlesnakes and coyotes. But deep down, he knew someone might be looking for her. Someone was maybe still hunting. And Samuel, who had spent years learning to keep people at arm's length, was starting to feel something he hadn't known he still had in him, a need to protect, not just because it was the decent thing to do, but because he couldn't bear the thought of her leaving with the same broken look she'd arrived with. The ranch was still struggling. The money was still tight. His father was still frail. But for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt full of possibility. And she was the reason. Thomas Hayes had been a force of nature once. Sharp-eyed, iron-willed, the kind of man who could gentle a wild horse and face down claim jumpers without breaking a sweat. But age and sickness had worn him down to bone and stubbornness. The fever had taken most of his strength, leaving him propped against pillows like a scarecrow in Sunday clothes, watching the world through the window of his sick room. He hated being helpless, hated that Samuel had to tend him like a child, hated that their once proud ranch had shrunk to a few head of cattle and a house that leaked when the rare rains came. So when Rose arrived, quiet and careful and steady-handed, it caught him off guard. At first he bristled at her presence, suspicious of her silence, thinking it meant weakness or worse. But over time, Thomas began to see things Samuel had missed. The girl's hands knew how to tend the sick. She folded bandages like someone who'd done it before. She knew which herbs to steep for fever, which ones to crush for pain. "She's not just helping," Thomas said one morning as Samuel spooned medicine into his mouth. "She's watching, like someone who's seen real trouble." Samuel didn't answer, but his hand paused halfway to the bedside table. "You be careful with her," Thomas added, softer now. "Some folks stay broken. Others just need time to heal." Samuel didn't need the warning. He'd been watching Rose, too, seen the way she moved through the house like she was used to making herself invisible, used to stepping light and speaking softer. When she'd first arrived, he'd tried to give her space, tried to treat her like hired help. But the way she moved through their home was different from anything he'd known, like she understood loss, like she carried her own kind of silence. Their days started before dawn, long before the sun turned the desert into an oven. Samuel would work the few head of cattle they had left while Rose tended to Thomas. They'd pass each other in the narrow hallways. Brief glances, Quiet nods, few words. But little by little, small courtesies began to grow. She started leaving coffee on the porch rail where she knew he'd sit at first light. He began bringing her wildflowers from the desert, knowing she'd noticed them tucked into a tin cup by the kitchen window. Their kindness wasn't loud or deliberate at first, but it took root. The first real moment between them came late one evening after a dust storm. Samuel had returned from checking on the cattle, his face and clothes caked with grit, his throat raw from breathing sand. Rose met him at the door with a basin of clean water and a cloth. "You don't need to," he said, but his voice came out rougher than he meant. She didn't answer, just handed him the cloth and turned back toward the kitchen. Something about that simple gesture, the way she didn't expect thanks or explanation, worked its way under his skin. It wasn't service, it was care, the kind he hadn't felt since his mother died. But not everything between them was smooth. Samuel was used to control, used to carrying burdens alone. Rose had her own rhythm, her own quiet strength, and sometimes they clashed in small, sharp ways. He didn't like when she ventured into the desert alone to gather herbs. She didn't like when he gave orders without looking at her first, like she was invisible. One morning, after he snapped at her for using too much water to wash Thomas's linens, she turned with eyes cold and level. "I didn't come here to be treated like I don't matter," she said simply, before walking away. That night, he left an apology in the form of a plate of food outside her door. She didn't say anything, but the next morning, the plate was clean and sitting by his boots. Then came Jake Morrison. Jake had been a neighbor once, back when he still had land to speak of. A mean man with yellow teeth and a cruel streak, he'd lost his spread to debt and drink, but he kept showing up uninvited, sniffing around for anything he could steal or swindle. The first time he saw Rose, he leered like he'd found something valuable lying loose. "Didn't know you were running a charity house now, Hayes," he said to Samuel, spitting tobacco into the dust. "She one of them mission girls?" The way he said it made Samuel's jaw clench, but he kept his voice steady. "She's here for my father." Jake just grinned and tipped his hat toward Rose, who was hanging laundry on the line. "Well, I'd keep her close. Pretty girls don't stay lonesome long out here." Rose was standing near enough to hear. She didn't react, not even a flinch. But that night, Samuel found her sitting on the porch steps long after dark, arms wrapped around her knees like she was trying to hold herself together. He sat down beside her without speaking. The stars stretched overhead like scattered silver, and the desert was quiet, except for the distant call of coyotes. "He talked about me like I was something to be bought," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Samuel's fists clenched. "You're not." "I know that," she said, "but sometimes it feels like that's all I've ever been to men." He wanted to ask what she meant, but the weight of her words hung between them, like a wall he didn't know how to cross. As autumn came to the desert, the heat broke finally, giving way to cool nights and warm days. Thomas grew stronger, able to sit up for longer stretches, even to walk from his bed to the kitchen table. Sometimes he'd forget things, names, dates, conversations, but his mind was clearer than it had been in months. It was Rose who suggested they try to rebuild the broken corral. "If we can gather the cattle in closer," she said, "maybe we can keep better track of them." Thomas's eyes lit up at the idea. For 3 days, the three of them worked side by side, pulling up rotted fence posts and stretching new wire. Samuel watched his father teach Rose how to tie proper knots, how to read the signs of weather in the sky, how to spot a lame horse from 50 yards away. He hadn't seen Thomas smile like that since before the fever took hold. But even with the progress, the shadow around Rose never lifted entirely. Sometimes in the early morning light, Samuel would see her rolling up her sleeves, and there would be faint scars on her arms, thin lines like old cuts, healed but still visible. Once, when a rattlesnake appeared near the well, she dropped to the ground and crawled backward before she realized what she was doing. The look of shame on her face when she stood up broke something inside him. Someone had hurt her. Someone had hurt her badly, and she'd carried it with her across miles of desert to their door. One night, when Thomas had fallen asleep and the house was quiet, Samuel found Rose sitting outside again, staring toward the mountains. "I had a sister once," she said without preamble, her voice flat and distant. Her name was Marie. She was barely 16 when she married a man from town, Victor Moreau. He seemed kind enough at first, brought her flowers, spoke soft. Samuel stayed silent, sensing that this was a door being opened that might never open again. But after they wed, he changed, Rose continued. Got mean. Started hitting her, keeping her locked up, telling her she was worthless. I tried to get her to leave, but she was scared. Said he'd find her, hurt her worse. Her hands twisted in her lap. One night she came to me bleeding, begging for help. I hid her in the old mission where I was staying. But Victor found us. He had men with him. Said Marie was his property. Said anyone who helped her was stealing. Rose's voice broke slightly. There was a fire that night. I don't know how it started. Maybe a lamp got knocked over in the struggle. Maybe. She stopped, shook her head. Marie got trapped inside. I tried to reach her, but the smoke was too thick, the flames too high. I could hear her screaming my name. Samuel's chest felt like it was being crushed. Victor told everyone I set the fire, Rose whispered. Said I was jealous. Wanted Marie dead so I could take her place. Some people believed him. I had to run. And you've been running ever since, Samuel said quietly. She nodded. Until I came here. They sat in silence for a long time. When Rose finally stood to go inside, she paused at the door. I need you to know, she said without looking back. I didn't kill my sister. I loved her more than my own life. I know, Samuel said, and he meant it. After that confession, something shifted between them. Not louder, just deeper. They didn't talk about feelings or make promises. They didn't need to. Rose began helping Samuel with the cattle. He started teaching her to read the account books. When she needed to go to town for supplies, he rode with her. When she came back unharmed, she smiled like she'd won something small but important. Then one day in town, Samuel overheard Jake Morrison talking to the blacksmith. That girl staying with the Hayes, Jake said, his voice carrying across the street. I heard tell she's got a reputation. Burned down a house over in Albuquerque. Killed a woman. Samuel's blood turned to ice, but he didn't confront Jake. Not yet. He rode home in silence, Rose beside him on the wagon seat, neither of them speaking. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, Jake's words echoing in his mind. He knew they were lies, or at least twisted versions of a truth Jake wouldn't understand. But the seed of doubt, once planted, had a way of growing in the dark corners of a man's thoughts. Rose sensed the change. Samuel's silences grew longer, his glances more guarded. When she asked if something was wrong, he only shook his head and turned away. It wasn't anger exactly. It was fear. Fear that he was falling for someone whose past might catch up to them both. Fear that he was letting hope blind him to danger. Thomas noticed too. You're looking at her like she might disappear, he said one morning while Samuel helped him dress. She's not a ghost, son. Don't treat her like one. But ghosts cast shadows, and Rose's shadow seemed to stretch longer every day. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning when Jake Morrison rode up to the house with two other men. Lean, hard-faced strangers with guns on their hips and cruelty in their eyes. Hayes, Jake called from the yard. We need to talk. Samuel stepped onto the porch, rifle in his hands. Say your piece and get gone. Jake smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That girl you got living here, Rose Delacroix. We heard she's wanted for questioning down south. About a fire, about a death. You heard wrong, Samuel said evenly. Did I? Jake's smile widened. Funny thing is, we got a wire from Albuquerque yesterday. Seems there's a reward for information about her whereabouts. Samuel's grip tightened on the rifle. "She's not going anywhere." "Oh, I think she is," Jake said. "See, we already sent word. Sheriff's riding up from Santa Fe to collect her. Should be here by sundown." Behind Samuel, the door creaked open. Rose stepped onto the porch, her face pale but steady. "I'll go with you," she said quietly. "I won't have blood spilled over me." "No," Samuel said without taking his eyes off Jake. "You won't." Jake laughed. "Boy, you gonna fight the law for a murderer?" "I'm gonna fight anybody who tries to hurt her," Samuel replied, his voice deadly calm. The three men exchanged glances. One of them rested his hand on his gun. "Your choice," Jake said, "but this ends one way or another." They rode off, leaving Samuel and Rose standing on the porch in the morning heat. "You should let me go," Rose said softly. "It's what they want. What they've always wanted." Samuel turned to face her. "What I want is for you to stay." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Even if they're right? Even if I did something terrible?" "You didn't," he said firmly. "I know you didn't." But did he? In the hours that followed, as they waited for the sheriff to arrive, Samuel wrestled with doubts he hated himself for having. What if there was more to Rose's story? What if his feelings for her had blinded him to something dark? Rose seemed to sense his struggle. She moved through the house quietly, packing her few belongings with the resigned air of someone who'd always known this day would come. "You don't have to stay for this," she told him, as afternoon shadows grew long. "I can face whatever's coming alone." "No," Samuel said. "You can't. And you won't." The sheriff arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the desert red and gold. He was an older man, weathered and tired-looking, with a badge pinned to a dusty vest. "Evening," he said, dismounting slowly. "I'm Sheriff Martinez. I understand you got a Rose Delacroix staying here." "I do," Samuel said. "What of it?" "Need to ask her some questions about a fire down in Albuquerque. About the death of Marie Moreau." Rose stepped forward. "I'm Rose Delacroix." The sheriff studied her carefully. "You look younger than I expected." "I've been running for 2 years," she said simply. "It ages you." Sheriff Martinez nodded slowly. "I've been talking to folks down south. Interesting thing is, most of them got a different story than the one that's been going around." Samuel felt his heart skip. "Turns out Victor Moreau wasn't the upstanding citizen he claimed to be," the sheriff continued. "Had a reputation for violence, for hurting women. And the night of that fire, 3 different people saw him and his men chase you and your sister to that old mission." Rose's eyes widened. "Also turns out," Martinez said, "the fire started in multiple places at once. Professional job. Not something a scared girl would know how to do." "Then who?" Rose began. "Victor himself, most likely. Wanted to destroy the evidence of what he'd done to your sister. Maybe figured he'd kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Get rid of you both, and make it look like an accident." Rose swayed on her feet. Samuel caught her arm. "He's dead now," the sheriff added. "Shot trying to rob a bank in El Paso last month. But before he died, he confessed to a priest. Said he'd done terrible things, including murdering his wife and framing her sister." The silence stretched long and heavy. "So you're not here to arrest me?" Rose whispered. "No, ma'am. I'm here to tell you you're free. Have been all along, truth be told. Just took a while for the truth to catch up. Jake Morrison never came back to the ranch. Word spread quickly through the territory that he'd been caught stealing horses and had fled south toward Mexico. Samuel didn't bother tracking him down. Some men created their own punishment. That night, Rose sat on the porch steps, staring up at the stars like she was seeing them for the first time. "I don't know how to be free," she said when Samuel joined her. "I've been running so long I forgot what it felt like to stay still." "Then learn," he said simply. She looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. What if I can't? What if the fear never goes away? Then we'll face it together, Samuel said. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. Winter came gently to the desert that year, bringing cooler days and star-filled nights that seemed to stretch on forever. Thomas grew stronger, even helping with the cattle again, though he tired easily. Rose began talking about expanding the garden come spring, maybe getting some chickens, perhaps taking in laundry from folks in town to bring in extra money. She still had nightmares sometimes, still jumped at unexpected sounds, but the hunted look had left her eyes. In its place was something Samuel had never seen before: hope. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Rose reached for his hand. I want to stay, she said quietly. Not because I'm running from something, but because I'm running towards something. Samuel squeezed her fingers gently. This is home, he said, for as long as you want it to be. She smiled then, the first completely unguarded smile he'd ever seen from her. Forever sounds about right, she said. The desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the promise of rain. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the moon, and another answered. The sound no longer seemed lonely to Samuel. It sounded like family, like belonging, like the end of one story and the beginning of another. Rose Delacroix had arrived at their door with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of sorrow. But in healing Thomas Hayes, in bringing life back to a dying ranch, in learning to trust and be trusted, she had found something precious, a place where she could stop running and start living. And Samuel Hayes, who had spent years learning to expect nothing good to last, had learned something too, that love wasn't about protecting yourself from loss. It was about opening your heart wide enough to let someone else's light in, even knowing that light might someday fade. But this light, he was betting, would burn steady and true for all the years to come. The morning after Rose decided to stay, she woke before dawn and walked outside to find Samuel already up, standing by the corral with a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. The air was crisp and clean, and the first hint of sunrise was just touching the tops of the mountains. Couldn't sleep? He asked as she approached. Too much quiet, she said with a small smile. I'm not used to peaceful nights. He handed her his coffee cup, and she accepted it gratefully, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic. We should fix up the old bunkhouse, she said, nodding toward a small adobe building that had fallen into disrepair. If we're going to make this place work again, we'll need somewhere for hired hands to stay come spring. Samuel studied her face in the growing light. You've been thinking about this. All night, she admitted. For the first time in years, I can think about tomorrow without being afraid of it. They stood in comfortable silence, sharing the coffee and watching the desert wake up around them. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily overhead, and the cattle began to move toward the water trough. Thomas is stronger, Rose observed. Yesterday he walked all the way to the south fence and back without stopping to rest. He likes having something to live for again, Samuel said. We all do. Rose looked at him then, her dark eyes serious. I know this isn't easy, Samuel. Taking in someone with my kind of past. If you ever change your mind, I won't, he said firmly. But Rose, I need you to know something too. This won't always be easy. The ranch is still struggling, money's tight, and there'll be hard times ahead. I'm not afraid of hard work, she said. I'm only afraid of being alone. You won't be, he promised. The sun crested the mountains then, flooding the desert with golden light, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Rose felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Over the following weeks, they worked together to breathe new life into the ranch. Rose proved to have a head for numbers, helping Samuel organize their finances and plan for the future. She also had a way with animals. Even the most stubborn cattle seemed to calm in her presence. Thomas, inspired by their energy and optimism, threw himself into recovery with renewed determination. He began taking longer walks, helping with repairs around the property, and even talking about buying more cattle come spring. "Haven't felt this good in years," he told Samuel one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. "That girl's been good medicine for all of us." Samuel nodded, watching Rose through the kitchen window as she cleaned the dishes, humming softly to herself. "I'm thinking of asking her to marry me," he said quietly. Thomas smiled. "About time." "When?" "Soon. I don't want to wait any longer. I've wasted enough time being afraid." "Good man," Thomas said, clapping his son on the shoulder. "Life's too short to spend it alone when you don't have to." Samuel chose an evening in late autumn, when the air was cool and the stars seemed close enough to touch. He and Rose had finished the evening chores and were sitting by the fire, she with her mending and he pretending to read a month-old newspaper. "Rose," he said, setting the paper aside. She looked up from the shirt she was patching. "Yes?" "I've been thinking about what you said, about being afraid of being alone." "Samuel, let me finish," he said gently. "I've been alone most of my adult life, by choice. I thought it was safer that way, easier. But you've shown me something different. You've shown me that being alone isn't safe. It's just empty." He stood up and moved to kneel beside her chair. "I can't promise you an easy life, or a wealthy one. But I can promise you'll never be alone again if you'll have me." Rose set down her mending, her eyes filling with tears. "Are you asking me to marry you, Samuel Hayes?" "I am," he said simply, "if you'll have me." She was quiet for a long moment, and Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. Then she smiled, that beautiful, unguarded smile that had become his favorite sight in the world. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed on a bright December morning in the little church in Santa Fe, with Father Miguel performing the ceremony and Thomas serving as Samuel's best man. Rose wore a simple blue dress that she'd sewn herself, and Samuel had bought a new shirt for the occasion. It was a small wedding, just the three of them, Father Miguel, and a few folks from town who'd grown fond of Rose over the months. But as Samuel slipped a simple gold band onto Rose's finger and promised to love and protect her for all his days, it felt like the most important moment of his life. "I never thought I'd get to be happy," Rose whispered to him as they stood on the church steps afterward, the winter sun warm on their faces. "Neither did I," Samuel replied, kissing her gently. "I guess we were both wrong." They honeymooned at the ranch, because neither could bear to leave Thomas alone, and because, as Rose said, she'd rather start her new life at home than anywhere else in the world. Their first years of marriage weren't without challenges. There were still bad seasons, when the rains didn't come and the cattle grew thin. There were moments when Rose woke from nightmares, sweating and afraid, and Samuel would hold her until the trembling stopped. There were times when money was so tight they lived on beans and cornbread for weeks at a time. But there were good times too. The year they were able to buy 20 new head of cattle. The year Rose's garden produced enough vegetables to sell at the market in town. The spring when Thomas announced he felt well enough to help with the roundup, and proved he still had the eye of a cattleman despite his age. And then, 3 years after their wedding, Rose discovered she was with child. "Are you certain?" Samuel asked, his voice hushed with wonder as they stood in their bedroom, Rose's hands pressed to her still flat stomach. "As certain as I can be," she said, smiling through her tears. "Samuel, we're going to have a baby." He swept her up in his arms then, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with joy. "Our own family," he said softly. "I can hardly believe it." "Neither can I," Rose admitted. "After everything that happened, I never thought—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I never thought I deserved this kind of happiness." "You deserve all the happiness in the world," Samuel said firmly, cupping her face in his hands. "You and this baby both." Thomas was over the moon when they told him the news. "A grandchild," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Lord, I never thought I'd live to see the day." He threw himself into preparing for the baby's arrival with the same determination he'd shown in recovering his health. He built a cradle with his own hands, carved toys from scraps of wood, and insisted on riding to town to buy the softest blankets he could find. "This child's going to be spoiled rotten," Rose said with a laugh, watching Thomas polish the cradle for the third time that week. "Good," he replied firmly. "About time we had something to spoil around here." Rose's pregnancy was difficult at times. The desert heat was hard on her, and she suffered from sickness that lasted well beyond the first few months. But Samuel never left her side when she needed him, bringing her cool water and sitting with her through the worst spells. "I'm sorry I'm such trouble," she said one evening after a particularly hard day. "You're not trouble," Samuel said, smoothing her hair back from her fevered forehead. "You're precious cargo." Their son was born on a cool March morning, arriving after a long night that left Rose exhausted but triumphant. Samuel held the tiny, red-faced infant in his shaking hands and felt his heart expand to a size he hadn't known was possible. "He's perfect," he whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Rose, he's absolutely perfect." "Thomas," Rose said softly, looking up at her husband with love shining in her tired eyes, "I want to name him Thomas, after your father." Samuel looked across the room to where his father sat, tears rolling down the old man's weathered cheeks. "Thomas it is," Samuel said, placing the baby in Rose's arms. "Thomas Hayes, welcome to the world." The old man lived long enough to see his namesake take his first steps, to hear him say his first words, to teach him to recognize the different birds that lived in the desert. He passed peacefully in his sleep on a warm summer evening, with his son and daughter-in-law at his bedside, and his grandson sleeping in the next room. "He was ready," Rose said softly as they stood by his graveside a few days later, little Thomas balanced on Samuel's hip. "He got to see his family complete." "He loved you like his own daughter," Samuel said, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Thank you for giving him that." "He gave me a family," Rose replied. "I'm the one who should be thankful." As the years passed, the Hayes Ranch prospered. Samuel and Rose added to their herd, improved their buildings, and watched their son grow into a sturdy, bright-eyed boy who loved the desert as much as they did. Other children followed, a daughter they named Marie, after Rose's sister, and another son they called William, after Samuel's grandfather. The ranch became known throughout the territory for its fine cattle and the kindness of its owners. Travelers often stopped by, knowing they'd find a hot meal and a safe place to rest. Rose had a particular soft spot for women traveling alone, understanding better than most what dangers they faced on the frontier. One such woman arrived on a blistering July day, dusty and hollow-eyed, leading a limping horse and carrying a baby who couldn't have been more than a few months old. Rose took one look at her and knew the signs, the way she glanced over her shoulder, the careful way she moved, the fear that never quite left her eyes. "Come inside," Rose said without hesitation. "You look like you could use some rest." The woman, who gave her name as Sarah, stayed for 3 weeks while her horse healed and she regained her strength. At first, she barely spoke above a whisper, jumping at every sound, clutching her baby like someone might try to take him away. Rose remembered that feeling, that constant vigilance that made sleep impossible and peace a foreign concept. "I can't pay you," Sarah said on her second day, tears streaming down her face as she tried to hand Rose a tattered coin purse. "I don't have anything left." "Did I ask for payment?" Rose replied gently, pressing the purse back into Sarah's hands. "You need rest. Your baby needs his mother healthy. That's payment enough." Sarah never said much about what she was running from, but pieces of the story came out in fragments over the days. A husband who drank too much and hit too hard. A mother-in-law who blamed Sarah for her son's violence. A town that looked the other way when women screamed in the night. "I tried to leave before," Sarah whispered one evening as they sat on the porch, watching little Thomas play with Sarah's baby in the dust. "He found me, dragged me back. Said he'd kill the baby if I tried again. But when he started hitting the baby, too. She trailed off, her arms tightening around her son. Rose felt her own protective instincts flare. You did the right thing. Running takes courage, not cowardice. Does it ever stop? Sarah asked. The looking over your shoulder? The flinching at shadows? Rose was quiet for a long moment, watching Samuel teach Thomas how to coil a rope properly. It gets better, she said finally. Time helps. But mostly, it's having someone who makes you feel safe, someone who proves every day that not all men use their strength to hurt. Sarah's eyes followed Rose's gaze to Samuel. Your husband seems like one of the good ones. He is, Rose said simply. It took me a long time to trust that, but he is. During Sarah's stay, Rose learned as much from her as she gave. Watching Sarah's slow journey from terror to tentative hope reminded Rose of her own healing, of how far she'd traveled from the broken woman who'd arrived at this same ranch years ago. Samuel, without being asked, began teaching Sarah how to handle a rifle, how to read tracks, how to disappear if she needed to. Every woman should know how to protect herself, he said when Rose raised an eyebrow at the lessons. You're preparing her for if he comes after her, Rose realized. I'm preparing her to never feel helpless again, Samuel corrected. There's a difference. One morning Sarah found Rose in the kitchen before dawn, kneading bread for the day. I used to love baking, Sarah said quietly, watching Rose's practice movements. Before, when I was young and foolish enough to think love meant accepting whatever someone gave you. Love means many things, Rose said, not pausing in her work, but it should never mean accepting cruelty. Here, help me with this. Your hands remember, even if your heart needs time to heal. They baked together as the sun rose, Sarah's movements growing more confident as muscle memory returned. When Samuel and Thomas came in for breakfast, the kitchen smelled like home and hope, and Sarah was smiling for the first time since she'd arrived. I haven't felt this safe in years, she admitted to Rose later that day. I'd forgotten what it felt like to not be afraid. But safety, Rose knew, was something that had to be rebuilt from the inside out. That night she heard Sarah crying softly through the thin walls, and she knocked gently on the door. The nightmares? Rose asked. Sarah nodded, her baby sleeping peacefully in her arms despite her tears. I dream that he finds us, that he takes my son away, that he... She couldn't finish. Rose sat on the edge of the bed, her voice gentle but firm. He can't hurt you anymore. But even if he could, you're not the same woman who ran from him. You're stronger now. You've proven you can survive anything for your child. How do you know? Sarah whispered. Because I was you once, Rose said. Different circumstances, same fear. Same certainty that I'd never be safe again. But look around you, Sarah. You found your way to people who care about you, who want to help. That's not accident. That's strength. When Sarah finally felt ready to continue her journey, she had plans instead of just hope. Samuel had helped her correspond with his cousin in California, who ran a boarding house for women and children. There would be work there, safety, a chance to build a new life. I'll write to you, Sarah promised as she prepared to leave, her horse now healthy and her supplies restocked. To let you know we're safe. Rose nodded, remembering her own desperate need for someone to care whether she lived or died. You do that. And Sarah, if you ever need anything, you know where to find us. As Sarah rode away, her baby secure in a sling across her chest, Rose felt Samuel's arm come around her shoulders. Another lost soul found her way, he said softly. Maybe we all just keep finding each other, Rose replied, until there are enough safe places in the world for everyone who needs them. When Sarah finally felt safe enough to continue on her journey, she pressed a small silver locket into Rose's hand. For your kindness, she said, and to remember that what you've built here, This safety, this peace, it matters to more people than just yourselves. Rose carried that locket with her for the rest of her life, a reminder of the power of offering sanctuary to those who needed it most. But more than that, it reminded her that healing wasn't just personal. It was something you could pass on, one person at a time, one act of kindness at a time. Years later, Rose would receive letters from Sarah, telling her about the life she'd built in California. She'd remarried to a gentleman who loved her son as his own. She ran a small shop, made friends, found peace. And when other women came to her door, desperate and afraid, she would offer them the same kindness Rose had shown her. "The chain keeps going," Sarah wrote in one letter. "Every woman we help has the chance to help another. You didn't just save me, Rose. You saved all the women I'll be able to help because of what you taught me about strength and kindness." Rose kept that letter in the silver locket, a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply show someone that they matter, that they deserve safety and love, and a chance to start over. The first winter after their marriage tested them in ways Rose hadn't expected. The snow came early and hard, trapping them in the house for weeks at a time. Samuel grew restless, pacing the small rooms like a caged animal, worried about the cattle scattered across the range. "They'll find shelter," Rose told him one evening as he stared out at the swirling white beyond their windows. "Animals know how to survive." "Some will," Samuel said grimly. "But we'll lose others. And we can't afford to lose many more." Rose understood his worry. They were still rebuilding, still walking the thin line between survival and prosperity. Each head of cattle represented not just money, but their future, their children's future. When the storm finally broke, Samuel rode out to assess the damage. He returned 3 days later, haggard and defeated. They'd lost 8 head, including 2 of their best breeding cows. "We're back where we started," he said, slumping into his chair by the fire. "Maybe worse." Rose knelt beside him, taking his cold hands in hers. "No, we're not. We have each other. We have Thomas. We have this house, this land. The cattle can be replaced." "With what money?" Samuel asked bitterly. "We barely scraped together enough to get through last winter." Rose was quiet for a moment, then stood and walked to the wooden chest where she kept her few personal belongings. She returned with a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "My mother's jewelry," she said, unwrapping several pieces, a pearl necklace, gold earrings, a delicate bracelet. "I've been saving them, but maybe it's time." Samuel stared at the jewelry, his throat tight. "Rose number. Those are all you have left of her." "I have her memory," Rose said firmly. "I have the recipes she taught me, the songs she used to sing." "These are just things, Samuel. Pretty things, but just things. Our ranch, our life together. That's what matters." They sold the jewelry in Santa Fe, getting enough money to buy replacement cattle and supplies to last through the rest of winter. It was a hard decision, but it taught them both something about what truly mattered, about the difference between sentiment and love. Spring brought new challenges and new blessings. Rose discovered she was pregnant again, but this pregnancy was harder than the first. She was often sick, unable to keep food down, exhausted beyond measure. "Maybe we should send for the doctor from Santa Fe," Samuel suggested one morning after finding Rose retching in the kitchen. "We can't afford that," Rose said weakly. "Besides, this happened with Thomas too." "It'll pass," but it didn't pass, and Samuel grew increasingly worried. It was Thomas, now a sturdy 3-year-old, who provided the solution in his innocent way. "Mama's sick like Grandpa was," he announced one day, patting Rose's hand as she lay pale and drawn on the sofa. "What did we do for Grandpa?" Samuel asked, playing along. "Made him drink the bitter tea," Thomas said solemnly. "From the plants outside." Samuel looked at Rose, who was already struggling to sit up. "The herbs," she said weakly. "The ones I gathered for your father's fever. Maybe there's something there for this." Together, They consulted the notes Rose had made about various desert plants and their healing properties. She'd learned much from the old women at the mission, and more from trial and error during Thomas's illness. "This one," she said, pointing to a sketch of a plant with silvery leaves. "Desert sage. It's supposed to help with nausea." Samuel rode out that very day to gather the plant, returning with enough to make tea for weeks. Within days, Rose was feeling better, able to keep food down, her color returning. "How did you know?" Samuel asked as they sat together that evening, Rose finally able to enjoy a full meal. "I didn't," Rose admitted. "But sometimes you have to trust that the land provides what you need, if you know how to look for it." Their daughter Marie was born healthy and strong that summer, with Rose's dark hair and Samuel's steady gaze. Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, insisting on helping with everything from feeding to diaper changes. "He's going to be a good big brother," Rose said one evening, as they watched Thomas gently rock Marie's cradle. "He's already a good big brother," Samuel replied. "Look how gentle he is with her." But caring for 2 young children while managing the ranch proved exhausting. Rose found herself stretched thin, trying to maintain the house, tend the garden, help with the cattle, and care for the babies. Samuel did what he could, but the ranch work was demanding, especially with just the 2 of them to handle everything. It was old Thomas who came up with the solution. "We need help," he announced one morning over breakfast. "Can't keep expecting Rose to do the work of 3 people." "We can't afford hired hands," Samuel said. "You know that." "What about trade?" Thomas suggested. "There's plenty of folks in town who need things we can provide. Maybe we can work something out." The idea led to an arrangement with the Mendoza family in town. Miguel Mendoza was a skilled carpenter, but struggled to feed his large family. In exchange for help during calving season and other busy times, Samuel provided the Mendozas with beef, milk, and vegetables from Rose's garden. "It's not just about money," Rose realized as she watched Miguel's oldest son, Diego, teach Thomas how to braid rope. "It's about community, people helping people." The arrangement worked so well that they extended it to other families. Rose began teaching the women how to preserve food, how to use desert plants for medicine. Samuel shared his knowledge of cattle and horses. In return, they received help with the ranch work, childcare, and various services they couldn't afford to pay for. "We're building something bigger than just a ranch," Rose said one evening as they watched several families gathered in their yard for an impromptu celebration. Diego was playing guitar while the children danced and the adults shared stories. "What's that?" Samuel asked, bouncing Marie on his knee. "A community," Rose said. "A place where people take care of each other." But community, they learned, could also mean complications. When Diego Mendoza began courting the daughter of another local family, a dispute arose over land boundaries that threatened to divide the group. "It's not our fight," Samuel said when Miguel asked him to mediate. "We should stay out of it." But Rose saw it differently. "If we don't help them work it out, we lose everything we've built here. These people aren't just neighbors, they're family." The mediation took weeks, with Samuel and Rose hosting meetings in their home, listening to both sides, helping the families find common ground. In the end, the young couple married, the land dispute was resolved, and the community emerged stronger than before. "You were right," Samuel told Rose as they cleaned up after the wedding celebration. "Sometimes you have to fight for the things that matter, even when it's not your fight." "Especially then," Rose replied, "because if you don't stand up for others, who'll stand up for you when you need it?" As their children grew, Rose and Samuel made sure they understood these lessons about community and mutual support. Thomas learned to share his toys with visiting children, to help the elderly, to treat everyone with respect, regardless of their background. "Why do we have to share our food with the Martinez family?" Thomas asked one day, after Rose had packed a basket for their neighbors, whose father had been injured in a mining accident. "Because when you were sick last winter, who brought us soup every day?" Rose asked. Thomas thought for a moment. "Mrs. Martinez." "That's right." We take care of each other because that's what family does. And sometimes family isn't just the people who share your blood. It's the people who choose to care about you. Marie, as she grew older, absorbed these lessons naturally. She was the child who always noticed when someone was sad, who shared her dolls without being asked, who comforted other children when they cried. "She has your heart," Samuel told Rose one day after watching Marie bandage the paw of an injured puppy with the same careful attention Rose used when tending human patients. "She has both our hearts," Rose corrected. "Your kindness and my stubbornness." When their third child, William, was born, he arrived during one of the community's most difficult periods. A drought had settled over the territory, lasting longer than anyone could remember. Crops failed, cattle died, and many families faced the choice between staying and starving or abandoning everything they'd built. "We could go to California," Samuel suggested one night as they lay listening to the wind rattle their shutters. "My cousin says there's work there, plenty of rain." Rose was quiet for a long time. "Is that what you want?" she finally asked. Samuel sighed. "I don't know what I want anymore. I just know I can't watch our children go hungry." But the next morning brought unexpected visitors. 3 families from their community, looking haggard but determined. "We've been talking," Miguel Mendoza said, his hat in his hands, "about pooling our resources, sharing what we have left. Maybe together we can outlast this drought." It was a radical idea, essentially combining their remaining cattle, their food stores, their labor. But as Rose listened to the families discuss the plan, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. "It could work," she said to Samuel later that day, "if we all work together, share everything equally." "It's a risk," Samuel warned. "If it fails, we lose everything." "If we don't try, we lose everything anyway," Rose replied. "At least this way, we face it together." The experiment in communal living lasted 2 years, through the worst of the drought and into the return of normal rainfall. It wasn't easy. There were disputes over resources, disagreements about priorities, personality conflicts that had to be navigated. But it worked. The families survived, their children grew, their bonds deepened. When the rains finally returned and they could afford to separate again, they did so reluctantly, having learned the power of true cooperation. "I'll miss having everyone so close," Rose admitted as they watched the Mendoza family move back to their own property. "They're not going far," Samuel reminded her. "And what we learned, that stays with us forever." The lessons of those lean years shaped how Rose and Samuel raised their children and ran their ranch for the rest of their lives. They never again hoarded resources when neighbors were in need. They never turned away travelers or those seeking help. They taught their children that strength came not from standing alone, but from knowing when to reach out and when to offer support. Thomas, their eldest, grew into a young man with his grandfather's steady hands and his mother's gentle heart. He had a gift for horses, able to gentle even the wildest bronco with patience and kindness rather than force. Marie, named for Rose's lost sister, inherited her mother's strength and her father's quiet determination. She was fearless in ways that sometimes worried her parents, but she also had an innate sense of justice that made them proud. Little William, the youngest, was the artist of the family. He spent hours drawing the desert landscape, the cattle, his siblings, filling the margins of every piece of paper he could find with detailed sketches that captured not just how things looked, but how they felt. "He has your eye," Rose told Samuel one evening as they looked through William's latest drawings. "The way you see beauty in hard places." "He has your heart," Samuel replied, studying a drawing of Rose tending to a sick calf. "Look how he drew you, like you're glowing with kindness." The family faced their share of challenges over the years. There were droughts that tested their resolve, cattle thieves who had to be run off, and the occasional friction that comes with any growing community. But through it all, they held together, drawing strength from the bonds they'd forged in their earliest, hardest days. Rose never completely lost the vigilance that had kept her alive during her years of running. She still checked locks twice, still noticed when strangers lingered too long in town, still kept that small knife tucked in her boot. But the fear that had once dominated her life had been replaced by something stronger. The fierce protectiveness of a woman who'd found her place in the world and would defend it with everything she had. Samuel, for his part, never stopped marveling at the transformation love had worked in his life. The solitary, guarded man he'd been seemed like a stranger to him now. In Rose's eyes, he'd learned to see himself as someone worthy of happiness, someone capable of building something beautiful instead of just surviving. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching their children play in the yard, Rose leaned against Samuel's shoulder and sighed contentedly. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" she asked. "If I'd never come here, if you'd turned me away." "Every day," Samuel said honestly, "but not with regret. With gratitude. Because every choice that led us here, even the painful ones, brought us to this moment." Rose nodded, understanding. "I used to think my life was ruined by what happened to Marie, that I'd never be anything but a woman defined by tragedy. But now I know better. We're not defined by what breaks us. We're defined by what we build from the pieces." As the sun set over the desert that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Hayes family sat together on their porch, surrounded by the life they'd created through love, faith, and the simple decision to believe that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. The ranch that had once been a place of struggle and sorrow had become something altogether different, a testament to the power of second chances, the healing that comes from being truly known and accepted, and the quiet miracle of finding home not in a place, but in the people who choose to stay beside you through all of life's seasons. Rose Delacroix. Hayes had arrived at their door with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of grief. But in the end, she'd given them everything: hope, healing, and the understanding that love, real love, isn't something you find. It's something you build, day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment, until it becomes as solid and enduring as the desert itself. Years later, when travelers asked Samuel what had made his ranch successful, he would always give the same answer: "We learned that the best crop you can grow isn't cattle or corn. It's kindness. Everything else follows from that." And Rose, listening to her husband's words while she tended her garden or mended clothes on the porch, would smile and know that they'd built something that would outlast them both. A legacy of love that would echo through generations. A proof that even the most broken people can learn to be whole again when they find the right place to plant their roots. The desert wind would whisper through the sage, carrying with it the sounds of laughter and life, and Rose would close her eyes and breathe it in, marveling still at the incredible journey that had brought her from a place of running and fear to this moment of perfect, simple peace. In the end, that's all any of us can hope for. Not a life without struggle, but a life where the love we give and receive makes the struggle worthwhile. And in that little adobe house on the edge of the vast New Mexico desert, love had indeed made everything worthwhile.